I've never played a Metroid game before.
What the?
Well, sort of. I've dabbled into the original and Super Metroid, but never got more than a few minutes into them. Weirdly enough, the Metroid game that I logged the most hours in was probably the Metroid Prime Hunters demo that was included with the original Fat DS. But still, I wouldn't really count any of those experiences as actually playing a Metroid game. It's a gap in my Nintendo gaming history that has filled me with shame and regret in my old age. It's a mistake I aim to rectify. But I needed to figure out which game would be my starting point. My buddy Cardno already did a video on his first experience playing Super Metroid, so I didn't want to step on his toes by covering the same game. The original would probably be a good choice, but I'll be honest, sometimes my ADHD-addled brain has a really hard time going back to these old NES games when I don't have nostalgia for them. Sorry, I guess I'll have to hand in my true gamer card to the relevant authorities. But the GameCube happens to be my favorite console of all time, and the original Metroid Prime happens to be the highest scoring game on Metacritic from the console. For today's episode of Missing Out on a Masterpiece, I will be playing Metroid Prime for the first time in my entire life. Metroid Prime's opening level sees Samus responding to a distress beacon from a space station orbiting above the planet Talon 4. As we land on the outside of the station, the game gradually introduces the player to its control scheme. And as I glanced around the abandoned, eerily quiet vastness of computer-generated space, only one question was going through my mind. What in the fuck are these controls? If you've never played Metroid Prime before, it's hard to convey how jarring this game feels, especially after years and years of playing first-person shooters with pretty standardized controls. Unlike pretty much every FPS that has come out during the 21st century, Metroid Prime doesn't use dual analog sticks to move and aim. Instead, the left stick controls Samus's movement on the X-axis, and the C-stick is used to swap between different arm powers. You can move on the Y-axis if you hold down the R button, but it limits your movement and is really only good for solving certain puzzles rather than taking down enemies. To compensate for the lack of Y-axis movement, you have to pretty much rely on Metroid Prime's auto-targeting system when fighting, which kind of frustrated me when I first started playing because it felt like it trivialized a lot of the game's combat. The lack of Y-axis movement also made it more difficult to look around the world and soak in the game's environment, which, considering Nintendo had touted this as a first-person exploration game, kind of made me question why these controls are like this. Obviously, there's a certain amount of slack we have to give older games when it comes to their controls. It's an ever-changing medium, and judging old titles by modern conventions can lead to us missing out on what made these games work within the context of when they were released. But the interesting thing is that dual analog controls were pretty common during the time Metroid Prime came out. Games like Alien Resurrection and the PS1 port of Quake 2 had used the controller setup back in the late 90s. Metroid Prime was also released nearly a year after the original Halo. The point is, the game's controls were even outdated back when it came out, and player sentiment about the game's idiosyncratic control scheme were mixed even back then. But here's the thing, this is Nintendo, the masters of play. They don't ham-fist in shitty controls just because. Except that one time. There must be a reason why Retro Studios and Nintendo decided to go with this control scheme rather than the dual analog setup that was becoming increasingly common. So I put a pin in that thought, gave Nintendo and Retro Studios the benefit of the doubt, and continued on with the game. Upon entering the vessel, Samus discovers that it belonged to the space pirates, and the majority of the ship's crew have fallen victim to some kind of attack. Using Samus's visor, the player can get a glimpse of what happened to the space pirates. This scanning mechanic becomes the player's main way to interact and learn about the world in Metroid Prime. Examining the bodies of the crew, we find out that they had their spinal cords severed, suffered from severe burns, and onboarded some strange, unknown creatures who were giving off high levels of radiation. This is a Nintendo game, right? What impressed me right away with Metroid Prime's opening level is a certain amount of sophisticated storytelling that is simply not present in most other Nintendo games. Remember, this is the same company that saw two Paper Mario games receive overwhelming critical acclaim for their storylines, and then we're just like, nah, fuck it, we're just not gonna do that anymore. But as I wandered through the space pirates' desolated space station, scanning whatever objects I came across to get a vague sense of what exactly happened here, I found myself not thinking about Nintendo games. believe it or not, the first thing I thought of was Bioshock. Yeah, the last thing I expected was to be reminded of a critically acclaimed shooter that was a critique of Randian objectivism. And yeah, Prime isn't critiquing libertarianism, at least to my knowledge.
I say democracy is much worse than most people imagine, and markets are much better.
But there are a lot of similarities with how they relay their respective stories. Prime's scanning, in a lot of ways, is pretty similar to Bioshock's audio tapes. Only here is Prime delivering a story in this manner 5 years earlier. What's really cool is how Prime delivers its story and exposition in a way that doesn't break immersion. We learn everything through Samus's scanning system, the same exact way Samus the character learns everything. It's a totally Nintendo way of delivering the story, and Nintendo's goal of using retro studios to deliver more mature games, plus the advantage of having Prime's story basically be optional and told almost exclusively through scanning, gave the scenario writers a level of creative freedom to insert a more complicated story than pretty much any of Nintendo's other first-party games. While there is an element of vagueness and ample room for player interpretation, you get the general idea that the Space Pirates have been performing some kind of experiment with an unknown energy source. And, yeah, they fucked up. But I didn't have time to think this over, because I was soon confronted by the game's first boss, the Parasite Queen. And here the game teaches you the format that will hold true for basically every boss fight. You gotta scan that shit. That's the secret sauce that'll make the difference between hours of frustration or a relatively pain-free encounter. But the Parasite Queen herself is pretty easy, and although I was still getting used to the controls and did a lot of stupid stuff, I still managed to beat her with relative ease. That leads us into one of the Metroid series tropes that I was actually aware of, the manic escape the area because it's gonna explode sequence. I begun my daring escape. God damn it. After I reloaded the game and beat the Parasite Queen again, I begun my daring escape. Samus gets struck by that weird type of electricity that takes away your previously obtained power-ups and ends up on the planet Talon 4, where the game starts properly. And as I made my way through the Chozo ruins, learning the game's map system, scanning for lore, and still getting used to these fucking controls, a thought popped into my head about how this game feels within the larger context of Nintendo's gamography. This is the most Nintendo game that Nintendo would never make. Okay, what do I mean by that? As I mentioned before, Retro Studios was founded with the aim of creating more mature games, likely because Nintendo's reputation as the kiddie console was believed to have played a role in the PlayStation winning out the 5th generation console war. And while that philosophy may have gone to the wayside as Retro made more games, Metroid Prime might be the best fucking proof of concept Nintendo could have presented to the general public about what their intentions were with Retro Studios. While the game may present itself as more mature than Nintendo's other IP, it fucking oozes Nintendo game design. Landing on Talon 4 starts the actual game. From here on out, you're technically allowed to go anywhere, only limited by Samus's current gear. I feel like this is where things go wrong for me with a lot of other Metroidvanias I've played. I tend to get really overwhelmed by games being too open without any clear ideas of where you're supposed to go. I know a lot of people are into that, but it's just never really been my thing. Nothing stresses me out more in a game than seeing two paths and not being sure which path is correct. I hate when I've entered a certain area and realize I've progressed the story and I'm locked out of going back and getting that extra treasure chest or whatever it was that I missed out on. Also, I'm pretty sure I have like some kind of spatial awareness issue because I get lost all the fucking time in these kind of games. But the thing is, I generally had a pretty easy time navigating Metroid Prime. Sure, there were a couple times where I got confused or wasn't sure where to go, but that's basically unavoidable in this genre. But overall, the game did a good job of holding my hand without feeling like it was holding my hand. The game designers telegraphed puzzles and guided me in such an intuitive way that it almost felt subliminal. Throughout the game, Samus will get notifications about certain activities going on in different parts of Talon 4. This is where you have to go to continue the main story, but it also frees up the player to explore because I know where I'm supposed to go. My anxiety about missing out on some power-up by taking the wrong path is alleviated because I know that as long as I don't explore the area with the big question mark, I'll avoid triggering the next part of the story. On top of that, Metroid Prime does an amazing job of subtly guiding the player in the right direction. Take the main plaza in the Chozo ruins, one of the first rooms you'll come across after landing on Talon 4. The first door you'll find is one with some weird red brackets holding it shut and keeping you from blasting it open with your arm cannon. The game lets you know that this weapon can't open the door, so you head off knowing in the back of your head there's some goodies waiting for you once you get a weapon upgrade. Shortly after, the game leads you into a room with a little mini-boss fight that culminates in Samus gaining the missile launcher expansion. Oh, this is the same kind of door as that other door. And now I know that the missile launcher can open that door I saw before, and what do you know, that's how I get the morph ball and continue the game. Metroid Prime is full of moments like that. Moments that, in hindsight, are so obviously telegraphed by the game designers, but they don't feel that way in the moment. It was right around the time that I got to the game's first real boss, Flagra. That's the name they went with, huh? It was right around the time I started fighting Flagra and kept dying that I looked up some guides about it. I realized I wasn't strafing correctly, and once I did, the game kinda clicked with me, and I realized this game needs these fucking controls. When Nintendo said Metroid Prime wasn't a first-person shooter, they meant it. Going into this game expecting the familiar tropes of the genre will put you in the wrong mindset. Prime is a wholly unique experience, one that I'd argue would not be the same without this controller setup. To play Metroid Prime is to recalibrate your brain on what the experience of playing a first-person shooter is. The game is not about shootouts and cover systems, it's not about managing ammo and getting headshots. The game's lock-on system trivializes aiming, but it offers up something else in return. Metroid Prime is about puzzles, and that aspect seeps into every part of the game. Each enemy is a puzzle. The challenge comes not from trying to hit them, but how to hit them. Freeing up the player's aim allowed the game's developers to make more complicated and nuanced interactions with enemies. Retro Studios and Nintendo deciding to go with this unconventional control scheme is one of the main things that kept Metroid Prime from being just another first-person shooter. And I kept dying at Flagra because I had not accepted what game I was playing. I was in the wrong mindset. Flagra is not a boss that I have to shoot to death like I'm in Halo. It's a puzzle. A puzzle that can only be solved by playing the game the way it was meant to be played. I know that the Wii version of Metroid Prime allows you to aim with the Wii remote, and granted, I haven't played that version. But I strongly wonder how much it would change the game. So much of Metroid Prime is built around these weird controls. If that long-rumored Metroid Prime Switch remaster ever comes out, I'd argue that they should make the somewhat controversial choice of maintaining the game's non-traditional controls, because the entire game is designed around playing it with this specific control scheme. Metroid Prime is split between 7 major levels. The frigate Orpheon is basically the game's tutorial level, and you can't come back here because it kind of fucking explodes. The Talon Overworld is a swampy, green, vaguely Dagobah area that you'll find yourself coming back to time and time again, because Samus's ship is here, and this is where you'll have to return the Chozo artifacts you find throughout the game in order to enter Metroid Prime's final area. The Chozo ruins are a desert, and where I spent the majority of my time just figuring out how to play the game. The Magmore Caverns are the part with the bomb-ass music. The Phendrana Drifts are the seemingly required in all Nintendo games snow level. The Phazon Mines are the part you'll have to play over and over because there's like one save point at the beginning of the fucking level. And the Impact Crater is where the game ends. Yeah, you don't really do anything else there. Overall, I like Metroid Prime's levels, but they play it pretty safe with standard video game tropes. With the exception of maybe the Phazon Mines, most of these levels are pretty standard fare for Nintendo games. But that doesn't mean they're not interesting to explore. Unlike Bioshock, where much of the fascination comes from visually taking in Rapture, Metroid Prime keeps the player engaged not through the aesthetics of its levels, but by the secrets they hold. Almost every room has a hidden path, or a missile expansion, or some Chozo lore to scan and read up about the fall of the once great civilization. And this goes back to my critique earlier about the lack of Y-axis movement getting in the way of what I thought a first-person exploration game should be. But I think I was imposing my own views onto the game rather than letting Metroid Prime tell me what it's about. I kept thinking Bioshock or Breath of the Wild, a game about exploring and taking in environments. But that's not what Metroid Prime is, and it doesn't need to be. Me not being able to seamlessly look around the world doesn't hamper Metroid Prime's exploration, because that's not how Retro and Nintendo decided the player should explore. Exploration in Metroid Prime means using your visors to see hidden paths. It means scanning walls and computers to figure out what exactly the space pirates have been experimenting with. It means turning into a ball and riding up walls and finding a secret power-up. But that doesn't mean that the game lacks environmental spectacle in a more traditional sense. Getting into the space pirates' laboratories is when the game goes from good to just, like, fucking stupid good. The story and gameplay comes together in this beautiful piece of environmental storytelling and classic Nintendo gameplay. We've unlocked just enough powers that the game feels open and full of choice, and the revelation of the space pirates' phase on Discovery is just so beautiful. But you know, my enjoyment of the story does lead to what is arguably the most contentious element of the game. Let's talk about the scanning. Glance at any discussion about Metroid Prime's weak points, and you'll find time and time again that the thing that turns people off from this game is how you gotta scan, like, every fucking thing. Scan the computers, scan the enemies, scan the elevators, scan whatever the fuck this is. Metroid Prime's incessant scanning functionally serves as a means for Retro Studios to Trojan horse a pretty extensive story into a game published by a company that must have had, like, some kind of traumatic experience from a storyline as a child. With the exception of a handful of elevators and stuff, nearly all the scanning in Metroid Prime is optional. In some ways, it's sort of Breath of the Wilded a decade before Breath of the Wild. The story is there for those who want it, but you can easily blast past all the lore if you want. Although, I would argue that you're not really experiencing Metroid Prime if you avoid all the scanning. Like the game's controls, the scanning is something you need to acclimate your brain to. It's an important part of the idiosyncratic nature of the game. It adds atmosphere, nuance, and many of the game's more abstract puzzles can be more easily solved if you scan a couple computers. Now, where I do think the game kind of falters is the fact that the whole thing comes to a grinding halt whenever you scan something. Once again, I want to draw a comparison to Bioshock, and its use of audio recordings essentially solves for the problem that many experience playing Metroid Prime. You get your dose of lore while not stopping the pace of the game. However, one could also argue that Metroid Prime would be a significantly shorter game if you were allowed to listen to some of these scans rather than stopping and reading everything. I remember a couple points in the game where I died and I had to rescan a couple items, and wow, it's way fucking shorter if you don't read the scan sheets. So it's this odd thing where I do agree that scanning was probably A, a means to sneak in a story behind Nintendo's back, and B, pad out the game to a certain degree. But for me personally, I enjoy it. I think it helps immerse the player in the world of Talon 4, because we learn about the world in the exact same way Samus does. There's no awkward exposition dumps directed towards the player like Samus isn't even there. It's a bit of an acquired taste sort of thing. You're either into it or you're not. And look, while I personally don't mind the scanning and believe it adds to the game, I do sympathize with the players who get turned off by it. Before I get accused of being a Nintendo sycophant slobbering unconditional praise over a 15-year-old game, there is one big part of Metroid Prime that I have mostly negative things to say about. Bosses. I'm not going to count the game's mini-bosses like the Incinerator Drone or the Elite Pirates. For the purposes of this video, a boss is any character that has its own life bar. I already briefly touched on the Parasite Queen, and I don't have much to elaborate on her here. Basically, she's a tutorial boss, summing up all the things you've picked up on in Metroid Prime's opening level. The most important thing that the Parasite Queen teaches the player is how scanning each boss is basically going to be the thing that stands between a fairly painless action puzzle experience and hours of frustration. While the Parasite Queen boss fight itself telegraphs what the player is supposed to do fairly obviously, that definitely isn't true for some of the later bosses in the game. While the incessant reminders to scan the Parasite Queen are pretty fucking annoying, I can understand why Retro and Nintendo would think it's important to beat it into the player's head that they need to scan bosses. Basically, all you have to do with the Parasite Queen is lock onto her and move around so you can shoot past the energy barriers. She's pretty easy. Honestly, I struggled more with the escape part after the boss fight than the boss fight itself. Oh, Flagra. A mutated praying mantis that, unlike most Twitter users, actually needs sunlight to survive. I view Flagra as kind of a mission statement from Retro Studios about their intentions for Metroid Prime's boss battles. If there is any one boss that sees through Retro's design philosophy for the game, it's Flagra. It's impervious to your normal arm cannon hits, immediately letting the player know that this boss battle won't be about running and gunning. Charged arm cannon blasts can stun Flagra, but eagle-eyed players will note that this still does jack shit to its health bar. The way to beat Flagra is to stun it, then knock these solar panels out so that they're pointing away from Flagra, which opens up these little tunnels that you then morph ball into and blow shit up. This one boss battle alone almost single-handedly assures the player about what kind of game they're playing, and any doubts about Nintendo's mission statement about this being a first-person exploration game rather than a first-person shooter should be squashed right here. Flagra is ostensibly an action puzzle, and only through learning the game's key controls and power-ups that you've gotten up to this point can you beat it. Seriously, I was struggling with strafing, and I had been using the morph ball to move around the boss battle, and I got my ass handed to me for like an hour. Here's a tip so you don't end up like me. Just strafe. It's so much fucking easier. In the simplest terms, this boss battle is Nintendo as fuck. It's kind of where the game really clicked for me, and I finally understood what it was I was playing. But unfortunately, it's the only boss in the game where I feel like Retro's design philosophy came into full fruition. Thardos is a pain in the ass. He's much more straightforward than Flagra, and in a lot of ways is a much more traditional FPS boss. But that's basically what makes me lose interest in him. To beat Thardos, you have to switch to your thermal visor and figure out where his weak point is. Shoot him a bunch until his armor breaks and overloads your thermal visor, switch to your regular one, and then blast him again. And then do that for like a half fucking hour. Honestly, the biggest problem with Thardos is that he's just boring. Sure, it's not as simple as blast big rock guy until he dies, but the puzzles surrounding Thardos are not really all that interesting on their own, and he takes so fucking long to beat. But at the same time, I understand why he has this inordinate amount of health, because he really is not difficult. If Retro nerfed Thardos' health, he would straight up be easier than some of the game's normal enemies. Reading up on various forums after I had already completed the game, I was sort of surprised to see that the boss that is almost universally considered to be the worst was the Omega Pirate. Basically, this guy switches between two distinct phases. During the first part, the Omega Pirate is invulnerable. You gotta destroy his, sacks until they explode and he becomes invisible. At this point, the Omega Pirate is vulnerable, but can only be targeted by one of your visors. If you're fast enough, you can hit him with a couple of missile blasts and take out like a third of his health in one go. Now, I do understand why people don't like this boss. You spend a huge amount of time hitting him without doing any damage, and at some point he summons other space pirates and they get really fucking annoying to deal with, especially when they get stuck on a wall and you can't fucking hit them. But honestly, the Omega Pirate does have one saving grace that keeps him, for me at least, from being the worst boss in the game. And that's because up next is Meta Ridley. Holy Jesus, this boss sucks. Man, I was so excited for this fight. The game introduces you to Meta Ridley very early on, and there's a couple of moments where you see him flying around, and it just filled me with all this excitement and anticipation. I mean, they must be building up to something awesome by showing off this character literally more than the actual final boss. Instead, this is the most annoying battle in the entire game. And honestly, it all comes down to one problem. Meta Ridley spends most of the battle flying out of your reach, and you just gotta sit there, avoiding a couple of bombs until he comes back down, over and over again. And maybe it's a bit reductive, but honestly, the biggest problem with the Meta Ridley battle is that you spend a huge amount of it not battling. About halfway through Meta Ridley's health, he will land, but at that point the fight basically loses all strategy and attempts at even trying to match the older boss fights. Ridley will just repeat the same attack over and over, with the exact same strategy on your end to avoid him and hit him in the right way to stun him. It's just so disappointing, especially for what is, by far, the boss fight that the game hypes you up for the most. The final boss against Metroid Prime is fine, I guess. It's not all that difficult. In fact, this was actually the boss that I died the least to in my entire playthrough. The first half of the battle does a good enough job integrating all of Samus's various upgrades, but that's about as far as the puzzle fight aspect of the battle goes. Metroid Prime will change color and only become vulnerable to one of Samus's cannons, but once you figure out which one it is, it's basically just spam the A button until Metroid Prime changes color again. The second half of the Metroid Prime battle is just stupid easy. Like, it's almost insultingly easy. Like, I'm pretty sure I struggled more with my first run-in with a standard Metroid. All you have to do is flip to the right visor, lock onto Metroid Prime while standing in a pool of Phazon, and you fucking destroy it. And then the game's over. Now, I do have a sneaking suspicion as to why the bosses feel relatively half-baked compared to the rest of the game, and that's the fact that Retro Studios crunched like fucking crazy to get this game out under Nintendo's deadline. As we've covered before on this channel, so many quote-unquote bad game design elements in the AAA space can usually be traced back to publisher mandates and game designers just having to compromise on elements of production. I believe bosses like Flagra are a more accurate representation of what Retro aimed to accomplish with the boss battles, and for whatever reason, they weren't able to do that with most of the other bosses. Now, I don't want to leave anyone here with the wrong impression. I loved this game. Like, a lot. Like, much more than I thought I was based on the first couple of hours. I did apparently get the bad ending because when I completed the game, I only had around 60% done. Yeah, apparently there were all these other power-ups and stuff that I missed out on. Knock a couple points off my YouTube game reviewer score if you must, but that's never really been my thing. Despite being a brown guy with a beard, I am no completionist. But I think that it just goes to show how much stuff there is to do in this game, because I wasn't even attempting to finish it quickly. I thought I was discovering everything until I actually beat the game and realized how much I missed out on. For me, Metroid Prime is a game fundamentally about exploration. It's about secrets and puzzles, finding a seemingly ordinary room that contains hidden paths that can only be found by the player's own ingenuity. It's a game that doesn't hold your hand, but also doesn't leave you out to dry. It's a game that requires you to keep your brain on at all times. Every enemy is a puzzle, every room is a puzzle, and every puzzle has an intuitive solution. The game always rewards you for exploring. No paths are duds, and getting more health and more missile expansions are always worth taking time out of your journey to obtain. The most adventurous of players will be handsomely rewarded, but those who have less interest in the path not taken will not be wanting for excitement. While the game is extremely idiosyncratic and superficially obtuse, it's so assured in what it is that it gives the player ample space to decide what kind of experience they want to have. After roughly 20 hours of exploration, scanning, and morph balling, I can officially say I'm a fan of Metroid now. And holy fucking shit, Metroid Prime 4, please come out in 2022.